The U.S. presidential primaries are some of the most expensive, lengthy, and complex election systems in the world. But we're going to try to break it down anyway, because we didn't always have the primary system we have now. When the United States was first founded, and for more than a century afterwards, members of Congress and state legislatures were the ones responsible for picking each party's nominees directly. After all, these people were former aristocrats who didn't trust a bunch of peasants to pick their country's leader. 50 years after the first election, the U.S. had its first national convention. This is where the U.S. created its first delegate nomination system. Except back then, delegates were all picked by party members, meaning people still had no real say. Until 1910, that is, when Oregon established the first primary where the population at large could finally vote on who they wanted their presidential candidate to be. What's more, the delegates were legally obligated to follow the outcome of the popular vote. Americans were finally getting a voice. By 1912, 12 more states adopted the system. But for the most part, party insiders still controlled the nominating conventions. No better example of this exists than the 1912 election, when the Republican nomination went to William Taft. Even though Teddy Roosevelt won the popular vote, people didn't start to get really pissed about it until 1968. They'd rallied behind anti-war Senator Eugene McCarthy, but Vice President Hubert Humphrey ended up with the nomination. The thing was, Humphrey hadn't actually campaigned in any of the primaries. Naturally, people rioted, and these riots finally put pressure on Democrats to give the public more say in the nomination process. They created a new national system that outlined who could become a delegate, but it was still left up to each state to figure out how these delegates were chosen. This meant that the new delegate selection process varied a bunch from state to state. Then, in 1981, after Ted Kennedy decided to fight a rule that required delegates to vote for their ticketed candidate, Democrats decided to soften the requirement. Now, delegates weren't necessarily required to vote for their candidate, but it was strongly recommended they do so anyway. Members of Congress still didn't feel like they had enough say in the election process, though, and that gave birth to the unpledged delegates, otherwise known as superdelegates. Superdelegates are elected by people in office and have absolutely no allegiance to voters, so they give the party the ability to overrule the common folk when deemed necessary. Even though it's not nationally mandated, some states still require their delegates to follow the will of the people, while others leave the delegates free to follow their hearts. In some states, whichever candidate wins the majority of delegates actually just ends up with all the delegates. Others divvy up their delegates in proportion with the vote. Then, when it's national convention time, the combination of pledged delegates and unpledged delegates gets added up, and, God willing, we have our candidate. But if there is a tie, that's when it's time for a brokered convention. In brokered conventions, all the pledged delegates are free of any obligation to follow the will of the people, leaving them free to vote for whoever the hell they want. Theoretically, this whole convoluted system exists to create a balance between who the unwashed idiot masses think should be president versus what the party establishment wants. Still, with all the strict rules in place regarding who can actually vote for delegates, and the various loopholes that let these delegates swing wherever they want, the American voters really only get a pretty small say in who the next president is.